You've made your feelings about Trump known. Do you ever worry about preaching to the choir? Do you ever worry about only writing for people that already agree with you and that are further cementing their views and giving them more evidence? People will know before they read what you've written by the headline or just by the byline that it's not going to be positive to the president. So are you okay with that? And in a macro level, how do we talk to each other if that's the case?
Well, I came to this point in an unusual way. If you go back 5 or 6 years, I was a sort of run of the mill neocon and thought that John McCain would have made a fine president, Mitt Romney would have made a fine president. I was never a movement conservative, as they say, but I considered a lot of the principles, which are really 19th century liberalism with a small L, to be very valuable and an important counterpoint to other political views and tendencies in America. The notion of incremental change, the notion of unintended consequences, concerns about the misuse of power, attempting to bolster the rule of law, American leadership in the world. These were all things that I believed in deeply, and I still do. The irony is that I didn't change in these fundamental ways. The political landscape was flipped on its head because Trump took every belief that the Republican Party once had, more or less, and threw it out the window. And 90% of the party followed him like zombies off the cliff. And I think because of this personal journey, this ideological journey that I've made, I think I can talk to persuadable conservatives, persuadable centrists in a way perhaps some lifelong progressives cannot. Reminding them of the principles of their party, reminding them how contradictory these Republicans now sound as they are really just catering to Trump and looking over their shoulders. I'll give a very concrete example. We're recording this on the day that the Supreme Court issued really a stunning case, essentially finding that Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, its reference to gender, includes LGBTQ Americans. Stunning result, 6-3, in an opinion authored by Neil Gorsuch. And what I did was attempt to explain to people who thought, why would you have a conservative nominated by Trump reach this result? And trying to explain to them really what intellectually honest textualism looks like. He looked at the language. He did some logical thinking about the import of what the words on the page meant. And he was able to reach a result that was not simply a result that one would achieve by putting, the R jersey on your back or looking to the supporters who preferred your nomination. But I think the ability to explain how you get to that result and why I think that's not only the correct result, but if anyone still believes in anything approaching conservatism, the right result is something that not all people who I think have been on the left for most of their lives can do. And some things that they a priori simply accept that that's the right result sometimes need more explaining for people who haven't been there. So I think it's at times like that that I can perhaps fill in the blanks and in doing that, hold some of these people to account. I mean, there was nothing more horrifying that I can think of in my political life prior to the recent murder of George Floyd than the impeachment and seeing every one of those Republicans, most of whom knew better, lining up to make excuse after excuse for a president who had betrayed his country. And I think the ability to go back and to look at what these people used to think and used to say and holding them to account for their behavior now is a function that we in the what we loosely call the never Trumper world can do with clarity that perhaps others don't have. And I think that's in some ways a useful task. And it not only is for those persuadable Republicans or ex-Republicans. But for those people who say, well, Jennifer, I thought you were conservative. Why are you opposed to Trump? Or I thought you like John McCain. Why are you opposing, what Trump is doing, X, Y, Z? So it's an attempt to clarify an intellectually consistent line of thought, which explains why many of my dearest ex-Republicans now in Never Never Land folks felt so abandoned and betrayed by a party that repudiated many of these beliefs.
Would you agree that none of you Never Trumpers really brought people with you? As you said, 90% of the party stuck with the president, even though he brought a different set of values, principles, and political beliefs than, brought isolationism and protectionism, yet 90% stuck. Are you surprised that the group of you very, very influential and smart center-right thinkers didn't have more of a following?
I think we have to define what the following is. We were entirely unsuccessful in shaming elected Republicans into doing the right thing or to challenging Trump. But I think what you've seen is that the Republican Party, as we know it, is smaller than it used to be. That the people who feel betrayed, uncomfortable, disappointed, we have been successful in peeling off. They're no longer Republicans, so they don't identify as Republicans. They may show up as independents. They may show up as Democrats. And when you look at an election like 2018, where people say, well, the suburbs really shifted to the Democratic Party, a lot of those people were suburban, college-educated people who made that same journey with us. And whether they were registered as Republicans or not, most of them had voted for Republicans for most of their adult life, and they have been peeled off. I think their consciousness, if you will, has been raised. And I also do think that there is a value to twisting the knife and pecking at someone's consciousness. We're here. We are not going to let you get away with this intellectual dishonesty and this moral abomination. We're watching. We understand.
3 to 5 times a day we're watching. Yes.
Exactly.
Very, very prudent point. Very important point. As we close, I was just wondering if you could reflect, because you're such a keen social observer and political observer, and the way you write with passion about this country, maybe talk a little bit, if you would, about what you think the post-Trump world looks like.
I'm torn between a great fear that once in power, even if Democrats are able to take the Senate, which I think they may well do, the House and the presidency, that through infighting or dissension, that they will miss an opportunity of a lifetime.
The Democrats?
Yeah, exactly. And, it's funny. We who are ex-Republicans have been desperately trying to help the Democrats not blow this. We were some of the earliest supporters of Biden, and it's because we feel like we really kind of get this. We've seen you guys blow it before, and we know how this is done. But in all seriousness, I think if Joe Biden, who perhaps is exactly the right person, ironically, at the right time, is able to maintain his footing, is able to remain in what you can loosely call the center left or even the center, and capitalize on some new consensus that he can elevate and really improve, I think, how government operates in the country and maybe how our society functions. I think there is a much greater willingness now for the public, because of the pandemic, because of the economic crash, because of the murder of George Floyd, to embrace a more activist government, a more effective government. And I think the ability to translate these distinct problems into government solutions that people think actually improve their lives is a remarkable moment. And what I analogize it to, frankly, is the New Deal. Mm-hmm. FDR had this catastrophe. In our case, it's in some ways a man-made catastrophe. And he basically said, I have to preserve American capitalism and American democracy. But to do it, I'm going to radically have to change the way people relate to the federal government and the things the federal government does. And I think that's, if possible, maybe the post-Trump era is sort of like the New Deal. And the lesson of the New Deal is some of it didn't work. Some of it fell by the wayside. But a whole bunch of stuff actually did. And a whole bunch of stuff actually fundamentally changed the way we think about government, whether it is care for the elderly, whether it's public works, whether it was insurance for the banks. That there's a moment in which the public is ready to embrace something that is a little bolder, a little bit more daring, a little bit more, if you will, progressive than they otherwise would be. And when you can break through what people see are left-right issues and make them cultural issues, moral issues, it's just wrong for African Americans to be treated this way. Then you go beyond the normal politics, and you can, I think, achieve things that you might not have been able to do. The Republicans would be screaming states' rights. You can't tell the local police what to do. They're still screaming that, but I think they'll be very ineffective in getting that done because this new consensus has emerged. I would hope that we're able to do it in ways that can kind of keep as much of this coalition together as possible. It won't last forever, and it won't last beyond perhaps the first budget. But I think moving, in many ways, as Biden has suggested, expanding the ACA rather than kind of starting anew, expanding on climate change initiatives that he undertook under the Obama administration. That ability to kind of size up and branch out with ideas and things that actually do work, I think is a monumental opportunity. And I will say there's one significant issue that Trump opened in my eyes, and perhaps Americans as a whole did. And that is that extreme economic inequality is incompatible with democracy. You cannot have such great concentrations of wealth coexisting with abject want and misery and expect everyone to buy into a pluralist democracy. So even if you don't think the highest calling of economic policy is equality, it is a necessity that we start thinking seriously about issues of fairness, about issues of equality, about issues of polarization. And that, I think, has largely been a result of seeing what a authoritarian kook can manipulate when given the opportunity. And that we can't allow a society to continue that's ripe for the next Donald Trump, who may be less crazy and more skilled, frankly, at manipulating and dominating American society.
This podcast is called In the Bubble, and I cannot tell whether this episode is going to be called Changing Bubbles, Enlarging Bubbles, or Unequal Bubbles. But I think you are someone who did something very difficult, which is sort of question the bubble you were in. And we all live in these bubbles, and argue and criticize passionately in a way that if I were pressed with a gun to my head, I would say, why? Because how much you love this country. And all of us in our bubbles can recognize that just making it better and really proactively, constructively criticizing, which in some cases means a reasoned argument, in some cases means stamping your feet and saying, this is wrong, this is really just in the wrong place, this is not who we are, is a great sign of love. So between that and introducing Zach to his new cousin, who he didn't know he had, we discovered we were cousins by being on TV together. It's been wonderful to have you on and to talk with you.
It was an absolute joy, cousin.